Hello and welcome to This Week in Production, a special video edition of the podcast. I've been producing the Iditarod live stream for about 15 years, and I thought I would share some details behind the scenes information about how the race gets live streamed to a worldwide audience. Some background on the race if you're not familiar with the Iditarod. It's a 1,000-mile race that goes through the interior of Alaska, very remote, very pristine, but also very harsh environment. Most of the race is viewed on the internet via a subscription service called the Iditarod Insider that started 16 years ago.
And there's a beautiful setup here on the lake for the dogs to rest, for the mushers to rest. We've noticed that the snow is nice and hard packed on the lake. So
let's take a look at the tracker right now. And I know, Bruce, you can't see it, but our viewers at home can if Art Aldrich, our producer, puts it up. And
we're sharing a little insight and some time with us. I know the insiders certainly appreciate it. These guys working really hard out there to bring us really the inside scoop on the trail, the mushers, the footage of them through all that rough terrain. Thank you guys so much.
I was brought in to help Iditarod via Panasonic. Panasonic was supporting the race with the P2 HD equipment and tapeless workflow, which in a very cold environment works well. And after a few years, I started working directly for the race, mainly helping them in their live streaming efforts to bring that to a global audience. This year was the 50th running, and it was a special mile marker in their history. So there's some limitations to every job. This job is no different. It's a not-for-profit organization, and unfortunately, their budgets have gotten smaller and smaller every year, mainly due to attacks on their sponsors by PETA. It's just a reality of being in this business that they have to deal with, but of course, that means I have to do more with less. So it's a small crew. Mainly my cohort, Tom Chartrand, is my right hand. We do most of the heavy lifting on the live stream, though there are some camera ops and other people who assist with the production in the field, but mostly it's a two-man wrecking crew. One of the other limitations in Alaska in particular is the lack of bandwidth in general, and even when you get out into the remote regions, some places it's not even possible with satellite. So we know going in that bandwidth is going to be a challenge. The pictures are not going to be 4K. We stream at 720, and we're lucky if we can get consistent 2 megabit upload. The conditions are very harsh, and this is on a number of fronts. One, weather. It can be incredibly cold, 50 below zero, before we even talk about wind chills. It can also mean lack of infrastructure, running water, toilets, buildings, structure, things like that, plus lack of sleep. I've been on the trail a few years prior to doing the live streaming. It is not easy. Tom has been on the trail many years. He was on the trail this year running one of the live streaming rigs and also assisting in both the pre and post race production. So it's not cut out for everybody. It's a 24/7 job when the race is running. Sleep is limited, which affects every aspect of your functionality. And it's a long job. It's about 28 days in state. I'm based in New York, so this is a long haul job. 28 days in state, and then for me, there's more days pre-production almost year round, unfortunately. Of course, you throw COVID into this over the past 3 years, which makes everything more complicated, and then you basically have a perfect storm to do a live streaming job, right? What can go wrong? I've built 3 camera kits that consist of a small camera this year, a Panasonic CX350, and there's an encoder, Iditarod encoder, which handles the streaming part, and then there's a small internet router and it's all built into a special Pelican case with some cable pass-throughs and set up. And those cameras stream back to my portable control room, sort of like MASH, right? It's a mobile Army Surgical Hospital. Well, this is a mobile control room that we start in Anchorage at the beginning of the race. And at some point, I need to break down the whole control room while still maintaining the live stream. And that control room hops to the end of the race just before the finishers get there. We set it all up again. We add some additional gear, and then we do the finish. So that's a tricky part of the job as well. And then in addition to the 24/7 streaming during the race, this year I had 4 live shows that I was asked to produce for the race that are normally handled by the local TV station. So we took on those multicam responsibilities this year in a budget-saving effort.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Front Street here in Nome, Alaska. It is time to crown a champion of the 50th annual Iditarod sled dog race.
So the first challenge in doing this job is the gear. There's no truck. There's no studio. Anything I need to do this job mostly has to come with me. There's one asterisk. Sometimes the audio I'm able to get in state from a local supplier, but pretty much everything I need has to come with me. So that means packing very carefully and planning how you're going to do that. This year, not counting the personal gear and the portable espresso machine, which I always bring, there were about 15 cases that handled the cameras and the production equipment. And on United, which is my primary airline of choice, I know that I can get the bags on at $50 each. There's not really any weight limit under 75 pounds. Technically, they'll put heavier bags on, but they start getting funny about it. So I try to keep my cases under 70 pounds if I can avoid it. $50 a bag. In past years, I've sent the gear up on commercial freight like FedEx. It's not any cheaper. And then you also need to allow for an extra week of lead time. Plus, the logistics then fall on someone else to get the stuff, from FedEx to the hotel, and becomes tricky. A quick note on cases. I use a lot of think tank cases because they're just built really well. I use them mostly as carry-ons, but I did purchase a couple of the Location Manager Series cases this year, and I use them to fit all the little pieces that don't fit in traditional rack cases. So things like my PTZ controller and headsets and surfaces, buttons, anything that's like not in a specific built case. I buy these little cases on Amazon and I put them inside the bigger Location Manager case. So I bought 2 of those this year, the 40 and the 50. Excellent use of filling up small things in those cases. And the other thing that I found this year that is better than what I had in the past was these SKB Studio Flyer cases, which the sides and the top come off and they become work surfaces. I went up switching out some traditional rack cases for these, and I like them. The other challenge that we had to deal with this year that we hadn't had to deal with in years past is that a lot of the gear had to go to Nome on Alaska Airlines. Normally we send it on a commercial freight from Anchorage to Nome, but because this year I had to keep everything running, I needed all the gear to stay with me until I moved, and that meant it had to go on a commercial flight with me. And I learned that Alaska Airlines has a different media policy. Only 10 bags per person. And when you have 23 plus cases and 2 people traveling, it makes it a little tricky. Plus, their policy is a little different. If the bag is over 50 pounds, you pay $100 per case. So, we wound up spending quite a bit in baggage excess fees, but overall still cheaper and more reliable than sending it on commercial carrier. So what about the system? Being that my live streaming jobs are mostly done on the road, I've built my system as a portable system. The core of my system is basically an Apple 16-inch M1 Max laptop. I bought the model with 32 gigabytes of RAM. Do I regret that? I don't. I haven't seen any hindrance versus 64 gigs, but of course, that changes all the time. The other piece of my system is a piece of amazing software called Mimo Live. It handles all of my video in, out, switching, graphics, video playback, streaming, everything. Amazing, amazing tool. Awesome developers, small team, very responsive to input from users. And then I have a spare machine, which is a backup slash graphics slash video playback. This is an i9, 2019 i9 model, and that's because it is pre-Mac OS Monterey. And Monterey still breaks a few pieces of software for me, so this is like an insurance policy that I have an older machine that can run Big Sur. The rest of the system is mainly PTZs. I have Panasonic robotics. I also have the ability to use handheld cameras for some of the multicam jobs that I do for the Iditarod. I have a fiber system, a hybrid fiber system for the PTZs. It's made by Fieldcast, and it's called the Fiber One system. And it's basically a hybrid cable that does power, SDI video, and network in one fiber cable. And I have 325 feet per spool for 3 cameras. And there's little boxes that go on the PTZ side to break out SDI, power, and Ethernet. And I also have some fiber transceivers that work on single mode fiber for the handhelds. I have 2 1,000-foot reels of fiber, tactical fiber, that the silver bullets go on each side and break that, SDI into light and back. That's how I get video in and out of my system. So those feeds come in both on NDI and SDI. I have the ability, obviously, to do both. NDI is good for certain things, not so good for others. I prefer baseband video on SDI, but that does make things a little more complicated in terms of interfaces. I use a Decklink Duo card, which is a 4-input, 1080p input card. It's in an external enclosure that is made by OWC. It uses Thunderbolt 3. For the most part, this has worked really well, except when, Blackmagic did something in their drivers and something broke, and I was getting black flashes in anything connected to that Decklink card on the M1 Max. That was a frustrating thing. I went back and forth a bunch with the software developer, trying to troubleshoot, and some other users who had some experiences. At the last minute, I decided to make a switch to my backup system, which had a obviously different version of the driver that was not running under Monterey, and everything was better except for a couple of little wrinkles, but these things happen. But I also use Magewell NDI encoders and decoders. These are great if I need to bring in additional cameras and I don't have any more hard inputs on the box. I can bring them in on NDI. Very flexible, nice, well-made encoders and decoders. I also have a couple of AJA UTAPs. These are USB 3.1 devices. I have an SDI version and an HDMI version. And these are good, again, just to bring in extra cameras if I need them. And then to tie all of this together, I just got a CalDigit Thunderbolt 4 dock. which is really, when you're using a laptop, this is critical. It gives me multiple connectivity points, plus it powers the laptop. And as an added bonus, it's got a 2.5 gigabit Ethernet port. So that's great for doing NDI stuff on the road. My network is based on a gigabit switch, one of the new Netgear 4250 series. It's a multimedia design switch. It's got configuration profiles that make it really easy to program. Mine's a 24-port version that has PoE Plus power on all the ports. I use that power for many, many devices, including the Magewell converters. I have some Scarhoy control boxes that run on PoE. It's really nice, really clean. And I don't use it on the Iditarod, but I also have a recording rack that's based on the Hyperdeck Minis. And those also can be PoE powered for control and things like that. For audio, I'm using a Mix Pre 3, not the Mix Pre 3 2, just to be confusing. And this is just a simple way to bring in board feeds and microphones if I need them. It's just the right size, and it's bus powered and clean, and it works great. And then in terms of camera control and things like that, I have a Scarhoy PTZ Fly, and this is a great surface, can handle multiple cameras. So all three of my Panasonic cameras will plug into this on the Ethernet network, and I can control them, I can shade them, I can do all kinds of things. I bought this year a Scarhoy Color Fly, which is another surface meant to do things like shading and color correction on the cameras. There were big plans to use this with the Panasonic Field cameras over a VPN network, but at the last minute it did not work out. And then I have these two tablets that I bought to basically be extra screens for me. And these are great for just spreading out your palettes, windows that you need to run everything on. I thought the price was good and the size was good. They're only 1080 res, but what I found out was that the refresh rate on these are awful. So I'm probably going to dump these and just go with iPad Pros, the big iPad Pros in the future, just using Sidecar to run multiple displays, but we'll see. The portability, again, was the key. These are very small, very thin. Most things will work, but if you're doing anything like sports, the refresh rate's horrible. And I also have a, again, portability, flexibility. What do you really need to do the job? I see guys running big TriCaster systems, and they're great. It's not for me. It does not fit into my workflow and my needs. But I do have this cool little surface called a palette. I think actually they're called Monogram now, but when I bought them, it was called Palette. And these are like arcade buttons, very good quality buttons. And you can stack them, and I've got about 6 of them. And I plug them in USB, and I program Mimo Live to listen to the buttons for certain keystrokes, and I do my camera switching or my video rolls or my graphic rolls all through those buttons. It's really cool, and some of it's the buttons, a lot of it's the way Mimo Live works, letting me do custom commands and shortcuts and actions. All of this makes it possible for a single operator to run a pretty complex show. I have a rack that's dedicated to monitoring and audio. It's based around the SKB Studio Flyer 4-rack unit cases. I've actually rebuilt all of my gear into these cases. What I like about these cases is that the top and the sides come off. There's a work surface that's like a felt line work surface for a laptop that can go on top. And then the sides come off. And then you don't have to store the cases. The cases will just stack, and they can become functional in the control room furniture, if you will. The other cases that I had were the racks were inside the cases. And then, so of course, you take the rack out and now you have to store the cases as well, which can be problematic in a small confined space. So one of those things. But I've got a 4K scope, the Blackmagic 4K scope that'll do video or waveform. And I've got the Blackmagic audio monitor, which I like because it's powered and it has the LED meters. So even if I'm not listening to it, I can just look and make sure I'm getting program audio. And that's all fed via SDI. And I have a bunch of little throwdown converters from AJA and Blackmagic to basically take the output of MIMO, put it into SDI or NDI, and then I can stream that into anywhere I need to go, including the monitoring rack. In terms of the live streaming component from the field, I bought a system a couple of years ago from a company in Sweden called Iditarod. I've looked at all kinds of systems. I had a lot of Teradek products in the past. I looked at LiveView. I looked at a whole bunch, Avi West. For my money and for my preference, the Iditarod system was better. It did not require a subscription service like LiveView does. And I basically can, send it directly to my control room. I don't have to go through a intermediary server. So in terms of latency, I can get transmission latency on a good cellular connection of about a half second, which is pretty cool. Of course, bonded cellular does not play in Alaska, but I use these in the lower 48, and they work great. But in Alaska, we had Viasat iDirects, which are basically 1.2 meter dishes, and you can see in this picture how flat the dish angle is to the horizon. And, in some places, we could get a theoretical max of 4 megabits. Very rarely did we get that, but it's challenging. It's definitely challenging. What's cool about the Iditarod products is that they do have central monitoring and control via a web interface. So once the encoder goes online, there is a ability to reach through the web and control it. We're sending H.264 encoding back to my receiver, which is called the direct router. And it's basically like a video server in and out anywhere they need to go, including return video back to the encoders. Very, very robust system. And it's really, they call it the Swedish Army knife. Joke, haha. But it really is. This router lets me take net video inputs, baseband inputs, anything I can feed into it. It'll send it out, it'll stream it, it'll redistribute it. Very, very flexible, very, very cool. And you can configure it in different ways. Mine is set up to be basically an NDI tool. I didn't put the video cards in the router, so I don't get baseband out, I get NDI out. And that works for my workflow, but you do have the flexibility to build it any way that you would like. So the specifics were the Direct 600 encoders from Iditarod. The cameras were Panasonic CX350s. We took SDI out of the camera. The Iditarod router has the ability to generate a VPN network. So we took the second NIC on the encoder and we fed that back into the camera. And the idea was that we could run the camera shading on the Skarhoy Colorfly to control those cameras remotely. It worked in testing here in New York. But when we got into the field, there were some original plans to run a second backup master control room. I have a second Iditarod router to do that. We did it last year from Alaska because I was in New York because of COVID, and Tom ran one control room, I ran the other, and we had camera feeds going into both units. Made it very easy to function. We tried to do that this year, but being that Tom was going to be on the trail, I had to send the router to another colleague of mine who has a different network setup. And we could not get past his ISP's firewall. So unfortunately, we were not able to troubleshoot that in advance, and we got stuck, could not run the VPN network and the backup control room. One part of this job that I really enjoy is the innovation and the ability to come up with solutions on the fly that had not been planned for. And as such, this year was no different. We had the former champ, last year's champ, who was unable to be in state for this year's race, agree to be a sort of remote commentator. And the idea was that we'd get him on with the presenters that were in Alaska, Greg and Bruce and Liz. I figured out a way to basically do this using a Mac Mini and the Zoom Room subscription, which allows you to bring 3 NDI outputs out of Zoom. So I brought all of the presenters into a Zoom call. The participant from Norway was doing Zoom video, but the other participants were just on phone dial-ups for basically IFB so they could hear each other. And I brought their video in from the trail field cameras, and I mixed them with the NDI out from the remote presenter in Norway. And then I sent return video back to Norway so he can see everybody. And we did a 3-box live discussion, which worked pretty well for the most part, except when we had bandwidth issues on cellular from Norway. But it was something I was able to put together on the fly, just using the pieces that I had, the Mimo Live and the ability to send NDI out, spit that into a AJIU tap into the Zoom room, using Zoom's, really cool ability to do mix minuses, and then separate audio, separate video back in Mimo to create the production. Very cool. Lastly, just to wrap this up, there's always things that you learn. This year was no exception. I mean, if I'm not learning something on the jobs, then, it's not as exciting, let's say. But I'm always learning something on the jobs, and this year was no different. One thing I would say, I did not have enough cables, like short cables, connector cables, Thunderbolt, SDI, Ethernet. Like I had what I thought I needed, but obviously I needed more than I thought. So always bring extra cables as much as you can. Flexibility is crucial to this. And, you have plans, you have objectives. Sometimes they don't work out. At the end of the day, our job is to service the fans. And if we do things to keep the fans happy, even though maybe not was exactly how we planned it, things usually work out, but you have to be flexible and you have to adapt. And that, again, this year was important in many ways. The flexibility of the gear that I've chosen makes this possible in many, many ways. I can't say enough about the flexibility of the Intinor product, meaning being able to take in a multitude of inputs, not even from their own encoders. Like I was bringing in SRT feeds from a Teradek at one point. I was sending NDI back into the router to send return video down to the field. Very flexible, very cool. Mimo Live, the same way. Just the ability to send signals back and forth in and out without a lot of hardware just makes that product amazing. Firewalls bit me in the ass this year on a couple of occasions. Networking is not my forte, and unfortunately, they can introduce a lot of chaos into your universe. And one last thought on the Iditarod, but I really think it does service for many, many jobs, is you have to keep the audience engaged. And if you pay attention to that, if you keep the audience engaged, you'll have a successful show. So I hope that helped. I hope you were able to pick up some things maybe for your own live streaming needs. And be sure to tune in to This Week in Production podcast on all your favorite podcast platforms, including Apple and Google and Spotify.